you so much, Mo Husseini and Julie Cohen, for being here today for our inaugural first episode of Peaced Off. Mo Husseini is a Palestinian American filmmaker, writer, and creative director whose work spans film, live experiences, and political writing. And it's all driven by the same impulse to tell the truth in a way that people can actually hear. With Julie Cohen, Mo also co directed The Path Forward, a short documentary about Palestinians and Israelis who've lost loved ones but still choose dialogue over vengeance. And we're going to talk about that film today. Julie Cohen is an Academy Award nominated, Emmy winning documentary director and producer. She's directed more than a dozen documentaries, including RBG and My Name is Polly Murray, and co directed The Path Forward with Mo. And Abe Gurko is co producing Peaced Off Initiative at the Film Collaborative. He's a writer producer whose mission is also the title of his book, Won't Be Silent. Thank you all for being here. I'm super thrilled to have this discussion with you. And I want to start by just asking you about the path forward and what inspired you to make the film in the first place?
I, I, I was inspired by Julie, who reached out after I had written some stuff, and credit where credit is due. Like, really, I think Julie crystallized this into a project in a way that really made a lot of sense. I think both of us very separately were out there trying to find people who were doing the homework, for lack of a better description, of actually talking to each other and seeing each other and acknowledging each other. And through that process is actually how we connected, both of us. Julie had reached out to me, and I was like, oh my God, definitely want to talk to Julie. And really the project came out of that.
Awesome. And then, I mean, Julie, how did you, both of you guys decided on the subjects of film, but just can you talk about your process in choosing the subjects?
Yeah, I mean, like Mo says, each of us individually were out there on kind of a desperate, I would say, personal search for voices of sanity, I think, on the Palestine-Israel issue. And what interestingly we both found is that when you look for them, you will find them. Like, they're there. They might not be the main voices that one is hearing in the mainstream media, or God forbid social media, or even, like, truthfully, like, in, I would say, my own personal circles. Like, there's a lot of, like, flailing unhelpful noise. And the way that we chose from among the quite ample supply of voices, well, we kind of made a decision pretty early on that we wanted to do this in pairs, that the most useful conversations about this seem to be dialogues between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. And the way we selected, and there are many more that aren't in our film, the way we selected kind of our main people were the ones that kind of maybe resonated personally with the two of us. And truthfully, we were doing this on a very short time frame, so also people that were available, and we really focused around talks that people were doing in the US and in Western Europe, because we kind of meant this as a conversation for those who are talking from and listening from afar on this. So we just picked people who moved us, and with the hopes that they would move our audiences also.
Yeah, awesome. And I really like how you described it, because it really just aligns with the whole mission behind Peaced Off. So that's why we're so happy to be starting this initiative with you. And I mean, I'll start with you, Mo. What responses have you gotten from the film, from audiences in the region, anywhere, pro, con, whatever range of the responses? We'd love to hear about that.
It's interesting. I hear a lot of stuff out there about, people being really angry and not wanting to listen, and being very polarized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think, at least based on my personal experience, especially showing the film, being on the road, both with Julie and separately, talking to groups and stuff like that, kind of proving the thesis of the film, proving what Julie exactly just said, there's a lot more common ground than we are led to believe by the culture writ large. I think from a news media perspective, it is deeply boring to bring on rational people who want to look at the issues and have a rational discussion. It is a lot more interesting to bring, some lunatic right-wing, Jewish supremacists and some lunatic right-wing, fundamentalist Muslim, and put them on television and have them yell at each other. And what happens when you see that as a normal, in air quotes, person is you throw your hands up and you go like, these people are crazy. And the way that media presents that is they present that as if that's the mainstream, as if like the vast majority of Israelis are just unhinged and insane, Jewish supremacists, and the vast majority of Palestinians are, anti-Semitic fundamentalists or any of that. I think what I felt kind of going out and having these conversations is that there is a massive space in the middle that we have just ceded because it's difficult to speak. And I think, I'll speak for myself, knowing that it's mirrored by Julie on some level, but she can speak for that. But I've spent years not talking about this because it's so noisy and it's so hard to make a point sometimes, that as a person who wants to find a path forward, and like no pun intended, or wants to find a way to resolve this, it just starts to feel really frustrating because you're not paired with normal people. You're paired with extremists. And so it was super gratifying to kind of go out and present the film and be in these Q&A sessions where I think the first couple of times I was super nervous, like waiting to see what was going to hit us. And it was remarkably human and humane. I mean, even people who disagreed with us like adults. Like I certainly haven't experienced anything profane or negative, to where I felt threatened.
I'm happy to hear that. And Julie, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, look, there are plenty of people who are only interested in kind of triggering and provoking and then being triggered and provoked and don't want to have a reasonable conversation about these issues and are kind of just looking for the worst on the quote unquote other side. Like that is there, no question about it. But if you frame the conversation as the people in our film, and now the film itself does, in a more helpful, empathetic way, then that tends to draw, like there is a hunger for the message that the people in our film are giving. And so when we put it out there in the world, like this was the low budgetness of this project could not be overstated, and that goes to like that goes to the marketing of it. And yet when we had a week run at a theater in Lower Manhattan without any real marketing, people came to it. Like I know because I make a lot of movies. I know it varies. It can be really hard to even get your own friends to show up for your movie. This one, there were people who found it, including people who I don't even understand really how they heard about it, who just showed up. So, of course, our audience in the end ends up being somewhat self-selected. There are people who are coming for the message that the film has, but that's good. Like, one of the people in our film, Ami Dar, who's an Israeli American who lives in New York, has made the point, like, people are way too down on the concept of like preaching to the choir. Like, if you can get the choir all singing together, like from the same, hymnal, then just to throw in moving away from our Muslim and Jewish conversation to move it to Christianity, like, like getting those who share our thoughts about it, speaking out and singing out, like actually is a huge accomplishment.
I love that you said that, and there are plenty of Christians in the region, so that's great that you brought that
Yes.
in. And it also inspires me that we will one day get Peace Off to be a live event, and a peaceful one. Okay, so now like a little bit, not only about the film, but just your personal. I'm curious for both of you to speak to. Make us. We could start with Mo, your personal loss, how it's shaped your journey as a peace activist, if you consider yourself that.
Wow. I guess I don't really consider myself a peace activist, and not because I think there's anything wrong with being a peace activist or anything like that. I think it's a wonderful thing to do. I think it's more that I don't do enough to really consider myself to be that. Like I try to, or not try to. I am deeply introverted, and by that I don't mean like that I'm quiet and just sit in the corner. I'm not uplifted by interactions with a lot of people. I think, an upper limit of 8 people is where I feel comfortable. Much beyond that, I start to get drained by it. Um, that said, when you talk to me about the idea of personal loss and the shape of my personal loss, I think, you know, I've had people I know die. I've had people I love disappear. I've had, I've lived as a Palestinian watching our stories be erased or flattened or shoved into a convenient political framing that makes our pain either more palatable or less, or less sympathetic to other folks. And I want to be clear, like, I'm not centering myself in that. Like I'm extremely, I've been extremely privileged, and I've lived a life that has a lot of massive advantage that it would be ridiculous to kind of try and pretend like that I'm a victim here. I think the more honest thing to say is that despite it all, and this is what I try to model no matter what, is I think it's really easy, it's really tempting when you have a sense of loss um, to kind of get wrapped up in bitterness and to try to find meaning for your loss, for their loss, for all loss, and to try and give it value. And that value is imaginary fundamentally, right? And it's usually value that's created by people who expect you to understand or validate their reasons, or worse, to shut up. And I think the most honest thing that I can say is that my grief hasn't made me more tribal. It's made me more committed to breaking the whole tribal logic. Honestly, it's made me less interested in who's right and uh, uh, who's wrong, and more obsessed with stopping the machinery that keeps feeding on human lives, right? Like I don't want revenge. I don't want martyrdom. I want people to live long enough to grow old and cranky and pissy and irrelevant. I want kids to die of boredom in math class. When people ask me like what my dream is, I always say like what I wish for Israelis and Palestinians is a boring peace. The kind of peace where your worries are prosaic. Did I pick up did I pick up the dry cleaning? When do I have to be at the ball game? Like those kinds of mundane, normal concerns. I want those to be the concerns that Israelis and Palestinians have. So
My
sorry.
wife is the math teacher, so she's going to take exception to your dying in math comment, but that's okay. Julie, I mean, obviously I want to hear from you as well. And while you're adding to your personal loss and shaping your journey, I also want you both to speak to maybe this at the same time, dealing with, you talk about tribalism kind of mentality around this conflict, and curious how you also, Julie, deal with the extremes on either end, uh, in the face of what you're trying to accomplish here.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I'll start with your last question because truthfully, on the extremes issue, my way of dealing with that is trying to like block it out, trying to not, trying to like not let it absorb by osmosis into my brain and my heart and my stomach, because that's just a path towards like you're not getting anywhere with that. So, I try to like create the cone of of something. Um, you know, honestly, I mean, I think like personal loss on this issue to me is really just almost kind of like the loss that I feel as a member of the whole human race. Like, and I think that can actually be somewhat crushing. And of course, because I'm Jewish, I do feel more of a deep connection to these issues. But I feel like, you know, I mean, things are maybe shifting a little bit for the worse in this regard, but like to pretend like the experience in that I've lived in my life as Jewish American in terms of the amount of unpleasantness had to me is equivalent to what really any Palestinian American is going to experience, just like isn't right. I feel like that's where it is worth pointing out a point that one of the Palestinian stars of our film. Oh, sorry, that's some chihuahuas in the background.
You're invited.
Hey, Sally Abed from Standing Together, you know, made a point in our interview, which we decided like kind of belonged in the film, of like, you know, there is an imbalance of suffering here, and that kind of needs to be acknowledged. And I think I would make the same point in the context in America. Like, I don't think there are too many Palestinian Americans who haven't experienced, even if it's not even if it's not how someone treats you personally, but you're seeing the way that the whole culture or whole society just has a really stereotyped negative view towards your people in a way that I would say, in terms of my growing up, maybe a little different with my parents or grandparents, but in the way of my growing up, really wasn't an issue as a Jewish American. As I say, weirdly, things are getting a little bit are getting a little bit more complicated in the past few years for a whole variety of reasons. But you know, like I'm not motivated into this issue out of personal loss. It's almost the opposite. It's really more feeling like there's some, I mean, in the summer of 2023, before October 7th, I remember reading a story in the New York Times about Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and you know, how horrendously bad they are, and saying to my husband, like, you know what, Jewish Americans really need to speak up about this. Like, we should not be just letting like this like, I feel some personal connection here. Like, I don't like talking about Israel. That only leads to unpleasantness. And yet still, I feel like we should be doing something about it. I'm not sure what. I've always avoided making a film having anything to do with this, although I've done plenty of films that have to do with Jewishness. So I actually didn't do anything then, but then those were feelings that that returned pretty strongly as the war in Gaza reached its most intense, and the horrors of October 7th, and part of which was knowing what was going to come next. Like, so I don't know if I fully answered your question, but those
you
are.
did, and I hope, and if you don't mind, I just want to, I really appreciate everything you said, and this is not about me, but I would just like to suggest one thing to add to what you said, but maybe a little differently. Like, so I'm a Jewish Israeli person. I will just note that I do think, you know, it's scary what happened in DC. I take my kid to Sunday school, and I'm, for the first time in my life, a little worried something could happen. And I just want to acknowledge that. And
Yeah.
also for Israelis, that almost everyone knows someone who was killed on the 7th. And my brothers were actually at the Nova Festival. They were not killed, but so there's that. So I think it just,
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and actually, I've been to Israel a number of times. I have a number of friends who are either Israelis living in Israel or some Americans who moved there over the years. And I think that's maybe another distinction that needs to be made. There's a big difference vis-a-vis Israel issues of being Jewish American versus being Israeli American. Very, very different situation.
All of us want to stop the killing of our children and your children.
We are crying for the world to act now before it will be too late. What happened to my parents on October 7th? Some nights I cried throughout the night.
If somebody kills your brother, you want to hurt whoever hurts your family.
Every relationship that I will be able to build with Palestinians, it's very meaningful.
It didn't matter to me that his parents were Jewish. Those who were killed were my people too.
At this time of great pain, you choose to be together.
If not now, when?
I wanted to break the cycle of incitement, hatred, violence, revenge, rinse and repeat.
How can we move further away from this hashtag stand with Palestine or a hashtag stand with Israel?
If we are not able to grieve the loss of our humanity together, we will never be able to plan a future together.
Those who believe that bombs will bring safety, they are naive. They are naive.
We lost our compass of humanity, and we need to bring that back.
The idea that I should care more about a dead child who happens to be of someone who shares my nationality as opposed to someone who does not is insane to me.
וואו, אלפי תושבים הגיעו לתרום מזון וסיוע לתושבים של עזה.
People say, how can we work together? I mean, what other choice do we have?
I'd like to introduce our guest this evening.
So many Palestinians and Israelis started and shared the mission that this war will be the last war.
The film is amazing and hope everyone sees it, and we'll give people information about how to see it. But I don't want to use the joke of spoiler alert, but is there a moment in the film, where some kind of shared humanity that you want to talk about that sort of broke through ideology? Because, we're talking about ideologies here.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, everything between the time code 000 and 38 minutes. Literally every part of the film broke through that. It would be really hard to isolate a single moment. I think one of the things that we worked really hard on was to not turn this film into a film about the issues, a film about the destruction. You'll notice that people don't notice until you kind of point it out to them. We don't discuss the issues. We're not talking about, oh, Israel should do this, or Palestinians should do that, or we need to do this, or the right of return, or what are we going to do about the settlement? None of those things are things that we deal with. We fundamentally focus on the unbelievable bravery that it takes to just acknowledge the existence and the pain of the other, and we center that as the basis for moving forward. We are not offering anybody a solution to the Arab-Israeli situation. We're not saying do what Julie and Mo say, you know, these people sitting in the US in total comfort, like do what they say and everything will be fixed. We're not doing that at all. What we are saying is like, look, we don't know what the end state looks like, but we with 100% certainty know how you get to that end state. And that is by fearlessly looking at each other and acknowledging the fact that the trauma is not a pie, right? Like when I take a slice, it doesn't mean there's any less trauma for you. That suffering is not a competition. Like, you know, I keep referring to this entire situation as, you know, a trauma Olympics, right? Like you have conversations with folks on either side and it's like, oh yeah, you know, I'll see you a Nakba and raise you a Holocaust is what it sounds like, which like, I want to be super clear. I am not in any way diminishing the utter horror of any of these things. But fundamentally, I think what we wanted to say to people is like, look, Mao Zedong and Aziz Abu Sarra, by any rational measure, have every right in the world to hate each other, right? Like we may not agree with them hating each other, but I don't see a world where I, as a Palestinian, can go to a guy whose parents were murdered on October 7th and say like, hey, you should hang out with more Palestinians, right? And I don't see a world where you can go to somebody like Aziz Abu Sarra and say like, hey, I'm sorry, Israelis killed beat your brother to death in prison. You should be kinder to Israelis, right? Like they have every reason in the world to be irrationally hateful. And yet somehow these two people have both the courage, the moral clarity, and the ethical fortitude to sit with each other, acknowledge each other's trauma for the tragedy that it is, and work together to move forward. I mean, I woke up today and they're meeting with the new Pope.
Yeah, I saw that too.
It's their second Pope.
Their second Pope.
But like, I think what we wanted to try and say to people is like, look, if they can do this, like if these people who have every reason to reject cooperation and dialogue can do this, then you sitting on your ass in Dearborn, Michigan, or New York City can also figure out a way to talk to your neighbor and try and progress this forward. So that's kind of where we were coming from.
Absolutely, and with that mentality, practicing a peaceful mentality and understanding will facilitate a political solution. So even though your movie's not diving into the politics, it's showing the mindset that could lead to a political solution, which I totally love. Just turning a little bit for our last few minutes together, just to talk a little bit about not only the film, but you know, I mean, Mo, I saw you commenting on silence in social media, you know, and we've all sort of struggled with silence from all the sides, as it were. Different people have different perspectives on this, but I'm curious for you both to speak. I can start with Julie, I guess. What has silence from your own communities felt like to you, Julie, and then Mo?
Silence from my own community.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I sort of am inclined not to be too judgmental about silence because, as I was just mentioning, like I was pretty silent myself until recently. I think the thing that bothers me more is like those who are silent about Palestinian suffering, but are quite unsilent when our own people are struggling, or often are like complaining the loudest about the silence of the other, rather than like, no, why don't you model that by not being silent yourself? I mean, I have a lot of Facebook friends who've posted a lot over the past 10 days, like really hectoring everyone who isn't Jewish. Why aren't you speaking out against Sarah and Yaron's murders in Washington, D.C., when it's like, but why aren't you speaking out about, I mean, I could pick a number of specifics, but like, you know, about children who are on the brink of starvation in Gaza right now, and that's just a fact. And actually, if you spoke about the others, you might be surprised what came back. Mo and I both had the same response to Sarah and Yaron's being killed in to those murders in DC over the past week, which was to start posting on social media all of the really unsilent reactions from thoughtful Palestinians, including a number of those in our film. That's sort of the first place I looked. And again, if you look for it, you will find it, rather than running around saying like, why aren't Palestinians saying anything? Like, no, why don't you look and see what's actually happening? Like, rather than looking at saying in your mind, oh, nobody's speaking out about this, why don't you go look and see, can I find people that are speaking out? Once you do, you can create a really long thread of incredibly moving, thoughtful reactions, Mo's included, but also and my reaction to seeing that was to be doing more speaking out about specific Palestinian related suffering. And, there was that Instagram 11-year-old Palestinian Instagram star who was killed in an Israeli bombing this week, and posting about her. You just see what's modeled, what seems like it's effective and touches your heart, and then try to do the same.
Yeah, I would say we've certainly all seen that, the silence comes from both sides, right? Both Palestinian and Jewish communities are having a hard time, especially folks who are more moderate, right? Definitionally, when you're moderate, you're moderate. Right? It's hard to get really excited about being moderate, right? People don't talk about rabid centrists. I think it's disappointing on some level, when people you love and people don't say things and kind of refrain from commenting, especially when you know how they feel. And it hurts because in those moments of rupture, sometimes it can feel like things are unraveling and you're looking around to see who's standing next to you. And I know that the Jewish community has certainly felt this, and I know that the Palestinian community has certainly felt this. And, sometimes you find an emptiness when you thought there was a connection. And I think what I try to do is I try to remind myself that there's a reason, right? And that reason is that this isn't a space where people feel safe. It's a space that's wired with grief and fear and generational trauma and tripwires and booby traps and landmines everywhere, emotional landmines, historical landmines, moral ones, and frankly, psychological and psychic ones, right? And for most folks, really fundamentally good, ethical, moral folks, a lot of them just don't know how to step into that minefield without blowing themselves up, or blowing up the discourse, or suddenly being canceled, or feeling like your friends don't understand you, or whatever. And I think that people are deeply afraid of saying the wrong thing, of being accused of something that they would be ashamed of being cut off from their own communities, which are really important, especially in the diaspora for both Jews and Palestinians. And some folks get overwhelmed, and so they go quiet. But fundamentally, that silence still hurts, right? It lands like a betrayal sometimes when you're grieving. And I know that it's not always cowardice, and that sometimes it's just paralysis or exhaustion or the very human fear of being wrong in public. So ultimately, I try to hold space for both things, for both the ache and the understanding. And I think as part of what both Julia and I are trying to do now, and what I hope more of us are trying to do, is to build kind of safer spaces where the quieter voices can speak, where moderate voices, uncertain voices even, right? Emotionally tangled voices can breathe, and we can create space for that. Because unless we do, then silence really is the rational option. And the problem with silence is that the people who aren't afraid to be silent are the extremes. They're loud and extreme, and they poison the conversation. So really, like, I'm working to elevate the presence of the quieter and less insane voices, if that makes sense, and hoping that we can kind of support them and give them the courage to kind of engage.
Thank you for everything you just said, because I confess, I mean, A, I'm barely on social media. I'm on very few platforms, and I've also been very reticent for not all the reasons you mentioned, because I'd hate to think that I'd be wrong, as it were, but yeah, very afraid of just being misunderstood, or also trying to reconcile what the truth is, and also just like it's so people are so quick to attack and not discuss, right? They're so quick to debate and not discuss. I find it very challenging, but I really appreciate what you said. And I know Abe is really good at social media, so I'll just give Abe a voice before we take it to our last question. Abe, do you want to say anything about social media since you're so good at it?
Before we do that, I wanted to say what's great about the film and the way you tee up the whole idea of the humanity, which is to me it just strikes the chord as soon as the movie starts. And I thought that was such an effective way to tell the story that ultimately gets told. You know, my book Won't Be Silent is about having finally kind of waking up to the fact that when the Nazis were marching in Charlottesville was like a turning point. My parents were Holocaust survivors, and I was kind of grateful that they weren't alive then to see this movement, which is even more real now. But I have been very active on social media leading into the 2020 election because we were all in our homes, and I used that platform and that message to say, what better way to say I won't be silent than by voting? So that got me very activated in the space. And now I kind of feel like since October 7th, that whole community that I was part of, that we took credit for getting him out of the White House, was silent to what I was going through, which is deeply personal because I'm in a tiny minority, being a child of survivors. And it's just, I'm as someone who has kind of been about just not, you know, the whole political correctness has been such a problem, but for me for years, so that I don't care if I'm insulting someone, I just want to go back to humanity again. I just feel like we've all lost it a lot, you know, and so the silence is actually deafening, but it's also kind of expected because of how we just see how things move. But my TikTok algorithm has become extremely kind of so quieted that I don't even care to try to engage anymore, because it doesn't matter who am I trying to engage with. If it's all anger, like you say, who wants to participate in that? So yeah, it's been a journey to kind of see how the algorithm has become the enemy. Social media was always this place where we would find like minds and to be able to communicate and share values, but that's changed. So yeah, I say
I think it might
stepping back.
depend on the platform, right? And I don't want to. We'll wrap that up now, but it does seem like it depends on, like, TikTok is a different beast, for lack of a better description, than Blue Sky or than Facebook, maybe even, and whatever. But unless you guys have any last words on social media or anything else, and feel free to say those. My last question is just, you know, your movie's called A Path Forward, and any final thoughts about anything we've said today, and also what the path forward looks like for you and how people should engage? How can they find the movie?
Yeah, so I will make one response to what both of you just said, especially maybe orally when you're feeling bad about yourself for silence is fine if it's a listening silence. Like it's like what is the silence? So that's if you're quiet because you're listening and taking in, that can be fine. And to me, as Mo said earlier, you know, the film doesn't provide solutions, but in my mind, it does provide a first step. Like the first step has to sort of put aside all of the political geographical specificities, and to say let's wipe everything clean and start with love and empathy and listening to one another, like, which is what everyone in our film is doing to a certain extent. None of them perfectly, although most of them pretty darn well. That is not nothing. Like, I feel like what this film like, people talk a lot about microaggressions. I think what this film is about micro hope, like little and like, but the whole microaggression thing, like, that can actually like a little tiny meanness can like feel really mean when it's hitting you. And the same thing with hope. Like, you got to start somewhere. If there's a little bit of something, that's that's good. As far as finding the film, where the film is being distributed by Grasshopper Film. So I think of the first platform that it's going to be generally in available on is just going to the Grasshopper site, which is grasshopperfilm.com. Soon it'll be available on to rent on all the normal platforms where you rent a video. You could also arrange screenings by reaching out to Grasshopper or.
Yeah, and we'll also, for anyone listening, we'll make all this available on our website, and maybe we'll have a hosted, because we're going to work with Eventive on the so maybe we'll do stuff more with the film as well. Rent the film for a group and discuss after. Thank you so much for making it. And Mo, any final thoughts on anything?
Yeah, sure. Look, just quickly to kind of, I want to respond and acknowledge. No, I want to respond and acknowledge Abe's words because I feel them deeply, right? Like I feel I feel how the world wants to kind of flatten your pain and kind of minimize it and say, like, your pain is inconvenient, like shut the F up, right? Like, and I think that, look, we live in a world where almost every algorithm that we have controlling what we see and what we hear is tuned for rage. Rage is a powerful kind of activator. If you actually see what gets pushed on Facebook, it's not the stuff that gets most likes. Like, they actually don't track likes as strongly as they track, like, I hate this or I love this, right? Like, it's the stuff on the extremes, and that's what they push out to people. So you end up seeing stuff that's designed to get you pissed off, or more
pissed
even
off.
worse.
Sorry.
There you go. Exactly. I wish you saw more stuff that got you pissed off.
Well, that's what we're doing.
But I think I think like Abe, like I speak out and refuse to be silent while still kind of frankly being afraid of being misunderstood, right? Like, you see how quickly people pounce, how little grace there is for grief that doesn't neatly fit into some preconceived notion of, no, this is inappropriate grief that you're feeling. Like, you should feel this way. And where every word that you say feels like it could blow up. And fundamentally, to answer, how do we go back to humanity? What does the path forward to me look like? I don't think we go back. I think we begin. We begin moving towards humanity. And that's about naming the pain. That's about naming our fear of being erased, both as Palestinians and Jews. Me naming mine, and you as Jews naming yours, and both of us refusing to make our trauma the yardstick by which we measure all other pain, right? Like, that's the first step to me, like sitting with each other's grief and not debating it. I think that's what we tried to show in the film, is like, hey man, it is perfectly okay for you to acknowledge the Holocaust. Totally fine. Like, as a Palestinian, you can say, like, this is an awful thing. This is barbarity. This is inhumanity. Does not on any level minimize the shit that has happened to me as a Palestinian, and vice versa, right? Like, and I have many Israeli friends who will sit there and tell you, like, hey, I am deeply uncomfortable with the Nakba and all the things that have happened since 48 and 67, and certainly with what's happening in Gaza. And they don't say that in a way that is competitive, like we're in a trauma Olympics, like I said. They don't debate it, they don't dissect it. We just hold it and we let it exist. And I think, it's not flashy, it doesn't trend. Like, oh my God, look, it's a bunch of people not arguing is not exactly compelling media, but it's real. And if we want a way forward, if there is any path out of this mess, I think it starts with that kind of radical, uncomfortable human presence and an acknowledgement of that presence. And so it's not a return to anything for me. If anything, it's a path towards something better and hopefully more humane. I want every one of the 15 million people between the river and the sea to be, like I said, to have a boring ass life, right? In the best sense of the word boring, right? Like that is filled with only, mundane kind of concerns.
Here's to a path forward to a boring ass life in the region.
Amen.
Yeah, the movie's really great. I want to make sure you heard us say that.
Yes, it's bold, it's beautiful, and radically peaceful. And we're so honored to have you as our guests. And thank you for everything you've done and you're doing. And hope to see you again. And we can even have an event with the film. And with that, we're peacing off. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Be well.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
This has been episode 1 of Pieced Off, a curated film and conversation series presented by the Film Collaborative, with guests Julie Cohn and Mo Husseini of The Path Forward. Pieced Off is curated and executive produced by Orly Ravid. It is produced by Abe Gurko. Both Orly Ravid and Abe Gurko serve as moderators for this episode. Our head of audio and video production is David Averbach, who also serves as series art director. You can find more about this podcast at getpiecedoff.com.